And a big g'day to everybody there at Lake Bolac, involved in the farm planning workshop. Graham Anderson here, climate specialist with AgVic, just with a bit of an insight into what's going on with climate and weather. Hopefully it's useful for thinking about for your farm planning. So first of all, just looking at long-term rainfall history, here's a long-term record from Lake Bolac, goes from 1913 down this end all the way through to 2017's rainfall. And now the long-term average is right through the middle here, which is 538 mils of rainfall is the long-term average. But some years you can see gets way over 700 mils, and other years it's down, close to 300 mils. So a lot of variability there, and we'll talk about what's in that variability. Also, what's interesting, you can see this 2016 a wetter year, and we know sort of the climate drivers behind that and those two dry springs before it. So we'll talk about what's behind those wet and dry years. Also, what's really interesting in this record is the run of dry years that are early in that record. That's pretty unusual to see that many dry years. We look at a lot of these sort of sites around Victoria, so something was going on there. So even if that sort of natural variability point of view just shows that sometimes the run of years we had isn't that you've got to be prepared for whatever's coming. So that's a few dry years there. The other thing, just point out the last 20 years, when we look at all of the rainfall history for around the state, that Lake Bolac last 20 years, 10 have been sort of wetter than average and 10 have been drier. And that is really unusual when we look across Victoria, because we have sites that even have, 16 drier years and 4 wetter all the way through to that. But that's probably the only site I've come across where it's even. So that's obviously a great patch to live and farm. Here's that rainfall record again. That's just split into summer, the summer season, autumn, winter, and spring. You can see lots of variability there through all of the seasons. Probably the one thing that we would note, the springs, there's not been a lot of wet springs there in the last 10, apart from 2016. But autumn is one of the seasons which shows up in a lot of southeastern Australia as perhaps being a bit less reliable than it once was. So we'll talk a bit about that. What I'd like to just point out, these are the big drivers behind wetter years and drier years. So to make rain down here, we need a good source of moisture, and all of that comes from the northern oceans, and we've got the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Some years is very helpful with La Nina years, sending extra moisture. Also the Indian Ocean Dipole, like 2016, that extra moisture coming in, that feeds in. And when it hits the cold air, you can see all these cold fronts whizzing around southern Australia. We just happen to be in the part of the world where when the moisture hits that cold air, it falls out as reliable rainfall. So that's all good. Seasonal forecasting is a lot around just trying to keep track of what these areas of oceans are up to and whether they're in a helpful mood for us or not. Here we've got some sea surface temperature maps, which is basically anomaly maps. The water's a lot warmer along the equator and colder down here, but this is showing anomaly maps. So these sort of temperatures are where a bit of ocean might be 2 degrees warmer than it normally is, and these blue colors are where it's cooler. So forecasters look at these a lot to see what the vibe is. And I'm just showing you here what a dry pattern is. This is going back to September 2006, spring dry pattern. We've got an El Nino in the Pacific, so extra heat in the ocean out here, and where the warmest water is along the equator is where you'll find the most cloud. There's the warmest water has the most water vapor coming off it, and there's a lot of cloud and rain happening there. But you'll notice this area to Australia's north, that's sort of a drier looking pattern. When we've got sort of cooler than average temperatures there's usually less cloud and less moisture to feed into our weather patterns down south. So that's the sort of pattern that forecasters look out for. Now keep an eye on this bit to the north of Australia when I look at say what a wetter pattern looks like, see if you can tell the difference. So there we go, we're in October, the spring of 2010. It was pretty wet, so big La Nina out here, but you'll notice all of this extra really warm water to our north, heaps of cloud all over in our part of the world, and heaps of moisture falling, feeding into our weather patterns. Now that's what's behind the wetter and dry seasons. So that's a wet season outlook there. The difference between the seasonal outlook is just saying in those sort of years there's a higher probability of being wetter, but it's up to an individual weather event to determine who gets the bulk of that rain, and whether it falls north of the divide or south, that's up to weather events. But certainly that's what those seasonal forecasts some years can give a really good heads up about. Okay, now we've just got here, if you look back at history at anywhere's rainfall, a third of years were dry, a third were wet, and a third were sort of around average. Now we're just going to have a look at the Lake Bolac rainfall records and see if that sort of pattern of dry, wet, and medium changed during El Nino or Indian Ocean dipole years. So here we go, here we've got the Pacific Ocean influence. El Nino years has normally got less rainfall. And what we're looking at here is the August to November rainfall going back at the 26 times there was an El Nino at Lake Bolac. And when we do that, rather than a third of those years being drier, it's a bit more like 54% were dry. But you can still see an El Nino year doesn't guarantee dry because there was the odd year that was wetter and some were average. But it certainly increases the chances. When the Pacific's in its La Nina phase and sending more moisture our way, you can see those sort of wetter years, and at Lake Bolac, that August November, you can see that it really doubles the chance of a wetter season. And you can still get the odd dry one, but certainly increases the chance of getting average or wet. Now looking at the Indian Ocean dipole, you can see in those dry years there's a bit less moisture coming in from northwest cloud bands, and at Lake Bolac, whenever it's been in that ID positive drier phase, about half of them have been drier. So that reduces the chance of that wetter season. And then when you look at like 2016, when it's in its wetter phase, you can see that really increases the chance of wetter a bit, but certainly really reduces the chance of a dry season ID negative. So that's just good old-fashioned variability. Is there anything different to good old-fashioned variability that modern farming has got to contend with? So temperature is probably the big one. You can see here the last 100 years for Victoria. This is from the Bureau. Maximum temperatures in summer, autumn, winter and spring. Winter's being a bit milder probably is helpful for pasture and crop growth. That's all good. But summer's sort of, we're squeezing in an extra month of summer pretty well when we look at the last sort of 10 years. And of importance probably is looking at spring temperatures. If you look at the temperatures there from 1 to 3 degrees warmer in the last 10 years, we've had a couple of sort of close to average springs, but these warmer springs just meaning summer turning up a bit earlier, and that is a bit different. So, and we certainly get found out if that happens when we've got a season where there's not a lot of moisture. The other thing that's a bit different, this is the pressure pattern across southern Australia from 1950 through to 2016 or 2015, and you can see that area there. The actual pressure pattern's been getting a bit stronger. So the pressure pattern above our heads is a bit stronger than it used to be, and certainly since the mid-90s it's sort of kicked up and not gone back to any of those sort of places where it was. So that's sort of what was expected. It's probably happening a bit quicker than the climate scientists thought, but that's one thing that probably squeezes out the odd rainfall event each year these days. So looking at water planning and farm water, I guess a key thing to think about is changes to runoff. And so here's for Mount Emu Creek. It's got a bit of a record here from 1970s, but you can sort of see the sort of flows where we're getting up to the mid-90s were a bit more reliable than they have been since. So that's a key issue in terms of mapping out dams and water storage and what's enough for getting through dry years. So that trend's probably likely to continue. So that's just a key part of your farm planning. Another thing, this is a bit of work looking at the seasonality of rainfall. So it looked at, you can see here, these sort of areas are the summer dominant rainfall zones, and down here is the winter dominant zones, and these are sort of the areas where rains equally throughout the year. And when they looked at the rainfall that had fallen in the last sort of 15-16 years and compared that to the previous 100 years, they'd sort of found that these rainfall zones have all shifted south. So the summer zone shifted south, and some of that uniform throughout the year zone has shifted into northern Victoria. But that's largely what we'd expect. I guess the issue is that those trends will continue. The agriculture's, the successful agriculture happening all over the country. So climate zone doesn't determine how successful your farm is, but there is different systems set up for how you deal with that changing seasonality of rainfall. And these are all of the things that farmers are doing around the place to deal with variability and other things. We've got modern tech, R&D, genetics, innovations all coming through, which makes agriculture an exciting place to work. Improve farm and regional infrastructure and storage of water fodder, but even communications, transport, all of those things are really important in modern farming. Growth in local exports are really important, and also domestic market. Well, a key issue around biosecurity is certainly a really big one. Business management for variable use and income, that's a really key thing that separates a lot of farms in terms of how well they're setting up. And a key thing is when things are traveling well and you've had a good year, that's when it's good to work out, how do you invest wisely so you're set up for if you're having a tough year or the market's certainly dropped. So farm planning's a really important thing to look at. When you've having those good years, you can speed up some of those strategic investments on your farm. And farm planning, importance of looking at soils, pasture cover, NRM, how the farm's designed to set up to cope with variability, and the whole thing and why you're at the workshop, I guess, having good networks and knowledge channels and confidence to grow. Surround yourself with good people and knowledge, and you'll be right. So I hope that was of use. We put out monthly updates on season forecasts. If you're interested in getting them, just drop an email to the break at ecodev.vic.gov.au. All the best.